Picture this: a quiet night in a medieval village where a farmer steps outside his thatched roof cottage, tilting his head to study the stars. With nothing but a wooden quadrant, he carved himself and generations of whispered knowledge. He tracks the moon's phases, predicting the best time to plant his crops. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, a king lounges in his candlelit chamber, poring over a gilded manuscript filled with intricate celestial charts, convinced the heavens hold secrets to his dynasty's fate. Two worlds, one sky bound by the same stars yet divided by everything else. This is the untold story of how medieval Europe's peasants and princes alike turned their eyes upward, finding meaning in the cosmos but seeing entirely different truths. For the common folk, the night sky was a practical guide, a celestial clock dictating planting seasons, harvests, and even the timing of festivals. Their astronomy was born of necessity, passed down through oral traditions and crude instruments. But for kings and nobles, the stars were a language of power and divine right. Astrologers in royal courts mapped planetary alignments to justify wars, marriages, and political gambles, while the church wielded the heavens as proof of God's grand design. The same constellations that guided a plowman's hand were used to legitimize a monarch's reign. What's astonishing isn't just their shared obsession with the cosmos, it's how their interpretations of it mirrored the stark divides of their world. So how did these parallel astronomies coexist, and what can they teach us about the medieval mind where science, superstition, and social hierarchy collided? Over the next few minutes, we'll unravel how the stars became a battleground for meaning, from the humble star charts scratched onto peasant almanacs to the lavish, jewel-encrusted astrolabes commissioned by kings. You'll discover how a single comet could send tremors through a village and a throne room alike, and why the heavens were the one place where serfs and sovereigns stood quite literally under the same sky. This isn't just a tale of old telescopes and forgotten manuscripts. It's a window into how people across history have used the cosmos to make sense of their place in the world, long before modern science gave us all the answers. So let's step into the Middle Ages, where every star told a story, and whose story it was depended entirely on who was looking up. Take that farmer standing in his field again, squinting at the Big Dipper to guess when the first frost might come. His knowledge didn't come from books or scholars, it was etched into the rhythm of his life, passed down like a family heirloom. He might not know why the stars moved, but he knew if Orion rose too high by harvest time, the winter would be harsh. His astronomy was survival, written in the language of seed and soil. Now shift your gaze to the royal court, where a silk-robed astrologer bends over an ivory astrolabe, tracing Jupiter's path. To the king, that same planet isn't just a bright dot. It's a sign of divine favor, a celestial endorsement for his next military campaign. The stars haven't changed, but their meaning. That depended on who held the power to interpret them. What's fascinating is how these two worlds collected in unexpected ways. When a comet streaked across the sky, villagers might see it as an omen of blight or plague, while the nobility panicked over dynastic upheaval. In one famous case, a 15th century duke postponed his wedding for an entire year because Mars was in retrograde. Meanwhile, the peasants whose taxes paid for that wedding barely noticed the planet's shift. They were too busy using the Pleiades to time their autumn sowing. The church played both sides of this cosmic divide, preaching that the heavens declared God's glory, but cracking down on any peasant stargazer who dared predict events beyond the weather. After all, if a lowborn miller could read fate in the stars, what need had he for priests or kings? Yet for all these contrasts, the night sky remained a rare equalizer. In an age when a nobleman's horse was worth more than a farmer's lifetime of labor, both men stood equally small beneath the Milky Way. Maybe that's why medieval art so often shows shepherds and wise men gazing at the same star. The cosmos whispered different secrets to each, but it spoke to everyone. While kings consulted leather-bound tomes and jeweled instruments, the peasant astronomers' tools were far humbler yet no less precise. A notched stick planted in the dirt became a sundial, marking the sun's arc by the shadows it cast across carefully placed stones. A particular oak tree on the horizon, viewed from the same spot each morning, would align with the rising sun only on the spring equinox, signaling it was time to turn the soil. These were the ingenious tricks of farmers who couldn't read Latin or afford brass astrolabes, but whose lives depended on reading the sky's rhythms with unerring accuracy. Their wisdom lived in folk rhymes sung while sowing seeds, verses that encoded lunar cycles in catchy couplets. When the moon wears a halo, sow your wheat in the valley, wasn't just poetry, it was meteorology. That halo effect, caused by ice crystals in high clouds, a reliable predictor of coming rain. Generations of observation had distilled weather patterns into these easily memorized lines, turning children's chants into agricultural almanacs. And it worked. Studies of medieval crop yields show harvests timed by these methods often outperformed those guided by the church's fixed feast day calendar, which could drift out of sync with the actual seasons. The solstice markers carved into door frames or painted on barn walls tell another story of grassroots genius. In one English village, a slit in a cottage thatch allowed a single beam of sunlight to strike a specific floorstone only at midday on the winter solstice, a homemade solar observatory. Elsewhere, standing stones placed centuries earlier by forgotten hands still functioned as celestial calendars for medieval ploughmen. Unlike the royal astrologers' predictions of which noble might fall from favor, the peasants' stargazing had immediate, visceral stakes. Get the timing wrong by a week, and an entire year's food supply could vanish beneath early frost or summer drought. Yet this practical astronomy wasn't entirely separate from the mystical. The same farmer who used Orion's belt to schedule pruning might also hang herbs during a full moon, believing it amplified their healing power. The boundary between science and superstition blurred where survival was concerned. After all, if chanting to the Lady Star while planting peas seemed to make them grow better, why question it? What we'd now call confirmation bias was, for them, another tool in the kit, like the notched stick or the rhyme about red skies at dawn. What's most striking is how these methods endured. Long after universities taught that the Earth revolved around the sun, peasant astronomers kept using their great-grandfathers' techniques because they worked. While scholars debated celestial spheres in lecture halls, the woman winnowing grain knew exactly when to look for the dog star's first appearance, heralding the Nile's flood or the Baltic's thaw. Theirs was a democracy of knowledge, written not in parchment but in the turning seasons, the smell of turned earth, and the silent wink of stars overhead. No king's decree could shift the Pleiades, nor any cardinal's blessing hasten the spring. Under the night sky, if nowhere else, the peasant stood as master of his fate. While peasants measured time by the stars to survive, kings used them to rule. Take Charlemagne, crowned emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800, a date chosen not just for its symbolism, but because his court astrologers had scoured the heavens for the most auspicious alignment. They declared Jupiter, the king of planets, in perfect harmony with the sun that morning, a celestial endorsement of his divine right to power. This wasn't mere pageantry. When Charlemagne later ordered the construction of schools to study the stars, he wasn't promoting abstract science, he was building a propaganda machine. Every accurate prediction from his astronomers reinforced the idea that God spoke through the cosmos, and he had chosen Charlemagne as his voice on Earth. Helena of Aquitaine took this celestial stagecraft even further. Before her second marriage to Henry Roman II of England, her court astrologers produced a dazzling horoscope claiming Venus and Mars were locked in a lover's embrace overhead, a not-so-subtle hint that their union was written in the stars. Later, when their sons rebelled against Henry, Helena's supporters circulated prophecies supposedly gleaned from comet sightings, suggesting the heavens themselves sanctioned her defiance. For medieval monarchs, astrology wasn't just about predicting the future, it was about scripting it. A well-timed eclipse could legitimize a questionable succession, while a discovered prophecy in the stars might undermine a rival's claim. The tools of this cosmic theater were as extravagant as their purpose. While a peasant's wooden quadrant fit in a pocket, royal astrolabes were gilt in gold and studded with gems, less scientific instruments than crown jewels with functions. When the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Roman II wanted to intimidate visiting diplomats, he'd have his Arabic star charts unfurled across entire tables, their intricate diagrams proof that his grasp of the heavens and, by extension, God's will surpassed theirs. The message was clear: if he could map the motions of planets, surely governing men was child's play. But this celestial power play had a precarious edge. When Richard the Lionheart's coronation horoscope warned of great turmoil in his reign, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. His capture during the Crusades was spun as inevitable, weakening his authority. And when astrologers failed, blame never fell on the stars, only on the interpreter. After one French king's predicted victory turned to defeat, his court hastily declared the astrologer had misread Saturn's position. The stars were infallible, humans merely misunderstood their divine grammar. What's revealing is how this celestial pageantry mirrored earthly hierarchies. Just as peasants obeyed lords and lords answered to kings, medieval cosmology placed Earth beneath the moon, planets, and fixed stars, a cosmic feudal system. When a monarch claimed the stars dictated his rule, he wasn't just invoking God, he was asserting that the universe itself was structured to favor his reign. Yet for all their pomp, these royal dreamers faced the same paradox as the peasant astronomer. The stars they tried to wield as weapons of control were utterly indifferent to human affairs. A king might command armies, but not even he could hurry the spring equinox or delay a comet's passing. In the end, the heavens remained the one court where all petitions, whether whispered by a serf or shouted by a sovereign, went unanswered. Consider the wooden cross staff in a farmer's calloused hands, a simple T-shaped tool, whittled from oak, with notches marking the angles of the sun at planting and harvest. To the untrained eye, it might look like a child's toy, but to the peasant astronomer, it was as precise as any royal instrument. By holding it at arm's length and aligning the top with the sun while the bottom grazed the horizon, he could calculate the solstices within days. No gears, no inscriptions, just centuries of observational wisdom carved into wood. Meanwhile, in a palace workshop, a craftsman labored for months over a brass astrolabe so delicate it could fit in a nobleman's palm yet contained entire universes. Its rotating rete, etched with star positions, spun like a mechanical poem, while gemstones marked the brightest constellations not for function, but to remind the owner that even the heavens bowed to his wealth. The astrolabe's complexity was its own kind of theater. With layers of engraved plates for different latitudes, it could predict eclipses, tell time, and even calculate prayer hours, functions a peasant would never need. But its true purpose was display. When a duke pulled it from his velvet pouch to consult the stars before a battle, the theatrical flourish mattered more than the calculation. The gasps of onlookers confirmed his power, not the device's accuracy. Yet for all its grandeur, the astrolabe had a secret. Its precision often faltered. Surviving examples reveal subtle errors, misaligned star maps, slightly off azimuth rings because the artisans prized beauty over exactness. A noble's astrolabe was less a scientific tool than a cosmic scepter whispering, "I own the sky." Peasant instruments, by contrast, embraced brutal practicality. In the fields, a shepherd's shadow stick was just a post hammered into the earth, but by tracking how its shadow lengthened through the seasons, he could predict frosts weeks in advance. No need for Arabic numerals or Greek geometry. His measurements were written in footsteps. 10 paces from the stick at midsummer noon meant the shadows would stretch 15 paces by harvest, signaling the turn of seasons. These methods were so reliable that medieval agricultural manuals, written by monks who disdained peasant superstitions, quietly incorporated their findings. Even the church's official calendars eventually adjusted to match the lunar cycles farmers had followed for generations. The real divide wasn't just materials, it was access. A brass astrolabe cost more than a village's annual harvest, locking celestial knowledge behind gates of gold, but peasants hacked their own paths to the stars. In Northern Europe, they repurposed Viking sun compasses, wooden discs with Norman shadows to navigate fields after enclosure. Laws erased familiar landmarks. In alpine regions, herders carved star maps into birch bark, matching constellations to mountain passes. These weren't crude imitations of noble tools. They were parallel inventions born from necessity rather than vanity. When a king's astrolabe gathered dust in a treasure chest, the farmer's shadow stick was still in daily use, proving that utility outshone opulence. Yet both tools shared a poignant limitation. Neither could pierce the era's greatest celestial mystery, the erratic dance of planets. Peasants saw Mars brighten and assumed war was coming. Kings paid astrologers to explain why Jupiter backpedaled through the zodiac. It would take Copernicus centuries later to reveal the truth. The tools weren't wrong, but their users were staring at the wrong center of the universe. In that way, the humble cross staff and the gilded astrolabe were equals, both brilliant, both blind, and both proof that even in the Middle Ages, the stars humbled everyone who tried to claim them. When a medieval peasant pointed to the Great Bear constellation, he didn't just see stars, he saw a celestial plow dragged across the sky by the spirits of his ancestors. This wasn't mere imagination, it was a survival tactic. In a world where every harvest could mean life or starvation, the stars became a canvas for stories that made the unpredictable feel manageable. Take the widespread belief that shooting stars were souls fleeing purgatory, their fiery trails marking divine mercy. Spotting one wasn't just a spectacle, it was a sign to pray for departed loved ones, turning a random meteor into a moment of communal hope. These myths weren't distractions from reality, they were tools for navigating it. The constellation Orion, known to scholars as the Hunter, transformed into the Plowman in village tales, his belt of 3 stars guiding the timing of autumn sowing. Farmers swore that when the plowman's shoulders dipped below the horizon by midnight, the earth was ready for wheat. Such lore often held kernels of truth, observations honed over generations, disguised as legend. A story about the moon being chased by wolves explained its phases while subtly encoding a warning. If the moon wore a halo, wolves would indeed descend from the mountains, driven by hunger as winter thinned the herds. The sky wasn't just watched, it was listened to, a whispering library of survival tips wrapped in allegory. Christianity and older pagan traditions tangled in these star stories like vines on a cottage wall. The Virgin Mary might be invoked to protect against the elf shot of malevolent stars, blamed for sudden livestock deaths, a holdover from pre-Christian beliefs repurposed for a new faith. In Brittany, fishermen refused to set sail when certain stars bathed near the horizon, a taboo rooted in Druidic moon lore but later blessed by local priests as Saint Anne's warning. The Church tolerated these hybrids because they reinforced piety, even as they smuggled in ancient wisdom. After all, when a storm prophecy from the Pleiades kept villagers home on a day the church roof needed repairing, who could argue with heaven's will? The contrast with royal astrology couldn't be starker. While kings demanded precise planetary forecasts to justify wars, peasants accepted the sky's mysteries as fluid and alive. A red dawn might foretell a squall, but it could also mean the fire giants of old myths were restless, both interpretations valid, both useful. This flexibility let folk astronomy adapt where rigid astrological tables failed. When the Black Death ravaged Europe, court astrologers blamed Mars retrograde, while peasants turned to star-crossed herbs and constellation-guided quarantine rituals that unknowingly slowed the plague's spread. Their myths weren't just stories, they were shock absorbers for a brutal world. What's haunting is how these star tales outlasted the empires that mocked them. Long after Charlemagne's astrologers were forgotten, French shepherds still tracked the shepherd star Venus to time lambing season, and German mothers placed newborns in moonlight to ward off star sickness. The cosmos remained a place where the powerless could read their own truths, not in gilt manuscripts, but in the patterns their grandparents had traced with work-worn fingers. Unlike the astrologers' charts that claimed to command fate, peasant astronomy bowed to the sky's wildness, finding comfort not in control, but in belonging to something vast and ancient. In the end, their myths were the most democratic science of all. No one could tax the stars or fence them in, or claim they shone for kings alone. Michael Scott, the 13th century astrologer to Emperor Frederick Roman II, could recite the exact hour Mercury would appear in the morning sky, but his real genius lay in never promising more than the stars could give. When pressed to predict the emperor's death, he famously replied that Frederick would die near iron, near water, a deliberately vague prophecy that came true decades later when the emperor succumbed to dysentery in a castle by the sea. Scott's caution was well-founded. Court astrologers danced on a knife's edge, their credibility measured in celestial movements they couldn't fully control. One botched eclipse forecast or misread horoscope could transform a royal favorite into a traitor overnight. The best astrologers were master politicians disguised as stargazers. Take Jean Gannevet, who served the Avignon popes in the 14th century. His almanacs overflowed with precise planetary tables, but his survival tactic was the retrospective prediction. After a duke's sudden death, Gannevet would discover an overlooked conjunction of Saturn and Mars in the noble's birth chart, proving the tragedy was fated all along. This sleight of hand kept him employed for 30 years. Others weren't so lucky. When Henry V's astrologer failed to foresee the king's dysentery at the Siege of Meaux, he was dragged from court in chains, accused of conspiring with the French by ignoring God's celestial warnings. Fraudulence flourished where desperation met superstition. The 15th century Italian charlatan Antonio Torquato sold personalized horoscopes to gullible nobles, identical scrolls with only the client's name changed. His downfall came when two rival barons compared notes and found their supposedly unique fates word for word identical, right down to the auspicious alignment of Jupiter. Yet even genuine scholars played the game. The real magic wasn't in reading the stars, but in reading the room. Before casting a horoscope for Queen Isabella of Castile, her astrologer would discreetly inquire about her mood, her rivalries, even her menstrual cycle, then tailor his predictions accordingly. A warning about Venus in retrograde might conveniently align with her desire to postpone an unpopular marriage treaty. The line between science and sorcery blurred under pressure. When Charles VI of France demanded to know whether his wife was plotting against him, his astrologer Simon de Fers didn't consult the stars. He bribed her handmaidens for gossip, then framed their revelations as celestial insight. This dark alchemy of espionage and astronomy reached its peak in the Borgia court, where astrologers doubled as poisoners, timing assassinations to coincide with eclipses so the deaths would appear divinely ordained. Yet for all the deception, these courtly stargazers pushed astronomy forward. Their elaborate planetary tables, though often fudged for political ends, became the foundation for later scientific breakthroughs. And their greatest legacy might be unintended. By convincing kings that the heavens dictated their fates, they inadvertently funded the instruments and observations that would one day prove Earth wasn't the center of the universe after all. The very tools built to flatter royal egos ultimately dethroned them, a cosmic irony not even the craftiest astrologer could have predicted. The Church's relationship with the stars was a tightrope walk between piety and practicality. On one hand, sermons thundered against stargazers who dared predict human fate, a direct challenge to God's omnipotence. Yet those same priests who condemned astrology as heresy would quietly consult computer's manuscripts to calculate Easter's date based on lunar cycles. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was hierarchy. The Church tolerated celestial math when it served divine order, like fixing feast days, but burned manuscripts that suggested planets influenced free will. Even the humble peasant's almanac walked this line: prayers to Saint Swithin for rain were permitted, but woe to the midwife who timed births by Venus's phases. At the heart of this tension sat figures like the Venerable Bede, an 8th century monk whose scientific curiosity coexisted with deep faith. His treatise, On the Reckoning of Time, blended astronomy with theology, arguing that studying the heavens revealed God's craftsmanship, not challenged it. When he calculated the tides using moon phases, churchmen nodded approval, but when he speculated that Earth might be spherical, some clutched their rosaries. Bede's genius was framing science as devotion. To chart the stars was to trace the finger of God. Other clergy weren't so diplomatic. When Bishop Tempia of Paris banned teaching Aristotle's cosmology in 1277, it wasn't because he disbelieved celestial spheres. It was because philosophers might start asking who set them spinning. For medieval peasants, this church approved astronomy shaped daily life in unexpected ways. The ringing of Angelus bells at dawn, noon, and dusk wasn't just a call to prayer. It was a timekeeping system synchronized with the sun's position, courtesy of monastic observatories. Farmers might not own hourglasses, but they knew when the third bell rang, it was time to stable the animals. Even the church's ban on weather prediction had loopholes. A priest could preach against storm witches, then turn around and bless fields when Sirius rose because everyone knew the dog star's appearance coincided with summer droughts. Kings, meanwhile, played both sides of the celestial divide. When Pope Gregory reformed the calendar in 1582 to fix Easter's drift, Catholic monarchs like Philip Roman II of Spain adopted it immediately, not for piety, but to prove loyalty to Rome. Protestant rulers like Elizabeth I refused for decades, turning timekeeping into theological warfare. Yet privately, even devout princes kept court astrologers. Henry Roman VIII personal horoscopes still survive, their margins crammed with anxious notes about Mars's position during Anne Boleyn's pregnancy. The Church's real power lay in controlling who could interpret the sky's whispers. A peasant predicting hail from cloud patterns was a superstitious fool. A bishop declaring comets as God's wrath held absolute authority. This celestial gatekeeping reached its peak with the case of Secco d'Ascoli, an Italian astrologer burned at the stake in 1327. His crime, not stargazing itself, but writing that Christ's birth, and thus salvation was preordained by planetary alignment. To the Inquisition, this made the heavens, not God, the author of destiny. Yet just decades later, the same church commissioned lavish astrological frescoes in the Vatican Library, with zodiac signs guiding biblical scenes. The unspoken rule was clear: stars could decorate divine narrative, but never dictate it. What's striking is how these contradictions trickled down to village level. Church calendars marked saints' days alongside old solar events, St. John's Eve coinciding with midsummer bonfires, a pagan tradition baptized into orthodoxy. Farmers learned to cross themselves when sighting the new moon, merging folk wisdom with catechism. Even the fear of eclipses became a tool for devotion. Parish priests described them as God drawing a curtain across the sun to chastise humanity, turning panic into piety. The night sky, once a realm of wild myths, was slowly being tamed into scripture, but in cottages and castles alike, people kept looking up, finding their own meanings between the church's lines. For the medieval farmer, the Pleiades weren't just a cluster of stars, they were the hinge of the agricultural year. When this Seven Sisters constellation first appeared in the pre-dawn sky of late April, it signaled the last frost had passed and the soil was warm enough for sowing spring wheat. Miss that window by even a week and the crop might fail. But how did peasants without telescopes or parchment charts track such precise timing? Their tools were deceptively simple: a notch carved into a barn door, aligned so the rising Pleiades would shine through it on the exact morning planting should begin. Others used standing stones or notched sticks placed at the field's edge, turning the horizon into a giant sundial calibrated to celestial events. This wasn't guesswork, it was data collection across generations. A 15th century English farming rhyme warned, "When the coxcomb Pleiades climbs the hill, sow your barley, but hold your till." The till referred to winter wheat, which needed colder soil. Modern climate studies confirm the rhyme's accuracy. The Pleiades' visibility in April strongly correlates with soil temperatures ideal for barley, but still too warm for winter grains. Similar lore surrounded Orion's appearance in autumn, with German peasants timing the grape harvest when the hunter's belt cleared the treetops by midnight, a benchmark that ensured sugars had peaked but frost hadn't struck. Festivals, too, danced to the star's rhythm. In Brittany, the Calan Gaon festival marked when the Pleiades reached their highest point at dusk, signaling the start of winter preparations. Bonfires were lit under specific constellations believed to ward off blight, while in Italy, olive growers timed the pruning of trees to the waning moon after Sirius faded from view. These rituals weren't mere superstition. Lunar pruning reduces sap loss, and Sirius's disappearance aligned with the end of the dry season when cuts healed fastest. The real rebellion in these practices lay in their defiance of church-controlled time. While monasteries calculated feast days by the Julian calendar, often drifting out of sync with the seasons, peasants adhered to a celestial clock that never lied. When church officials declared a saint's day the start of planting season, only to see crops fail from early frosts, villagers quietly returned to their star markers. Even the names they gave constellations reinforced this practical wisdom. What scholars called Cassiopeia's chair became the shepherd's crook in the Alps, its position indicating when to move flocks to high pastures. Perhaps the most ingenious adaptation was the star pit, found in Scandinavian farms, a dugout lined with stones where farmers observed how the Pleiades' reflection in water tracked seasonal shifts. As one Icelandic saga noted, when the sisters float at the pit's edge, the earth remembers its warmth. This blending of astronomy, hydrology, and folklore created a resilience that abstract astrology couldn't match. While kings fretted over Saturn's retrograde, peasants trusted the stars they'd watched with their own eyes, a celestial literacy written not in Latin, but in the language of survival. When Halley's comet streaked across the sky in 1066, English peasants dropped their plows and clutched their children, certain the fiery tale heralded God's wrath. But in the court of William the Conqueror, that same comet became a divine endorsement of his impending invasion. This wasn't just superstition, it was celestial spin doctoring at its most potent. William's chroniclers quickly declared the comet a star with hair, a sign that heaven itself had ordained his claim to England's throne. By the time his ships landed at Hastings, even some Anglo-Saxon soldiers hesitated, whispering that the Norman Duke might truly carry God's favor in his sails. The same comet could wear 1,000 faces depending on who gazed upward. In Constantinople, Emperor Constantine V interpreted a comet's appearance in 769 as proof of his iconoclasm, God's fiery pen slashing through the sky to condemn idol worship. Yet Venetian merchants that same night saw only a navigational marvel, using its position to recalibrate their star charts for autumn trade routes. The cosmos didn't change its message, power and perspective did. Kings leaned heavily on this ambiguity. When Charlemagne's advisors warned him a comet foretold his death, he simply had his court poets rewrite the omen. The flaming streak became a celestial torch, lighting his path to immortality. Some rulers didn't just interpret comets, they staged them. The Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, facing unrest in 1261, paid an alchemist to launch a firework-like contraption timed with a predicted meteor shower. As dazzled crowds gasped at the heavenly sign, his priests proclaimed it divine approval for his new taxes. More brutally, the Mongols turned comet panic into psychological warfare. When a comet appeared during their siege of Kiev in 1240, Batu Khan's shamans declared it the breath of the sky god, sapping defenders' morale by convincing them resistance was futile against heaven's will. Yet comets also undermine the powerful. The Great Comet of 1186 sent King Philip Augustus of France into weeks of penitent prayer after his astrologers linked it to his recent military failures. In England, Richard Roman II opponents used a comet sighting in 1392 to fuel rumors that his tyranny had angered God, a narrative that helped justify his overthrow. Even the Church wasn't immune. When a comet blazed during the Council of Constance in 1417, reformers pointed to it as proof the papacy needed cleansing, while traditionalists called it divine wrath against heresy. The heavens became a Rorschach test for medieval anxieties, their meaning as malleable as wet clay. What's revealing is how these cosmic dramas played out in villages versus throne rooms. Peasants tied comets to immediate, visceral fears: crop blight, stillborn livestock, the cough that might become plague. Their responses were tactile, hanging garlic from doorways, brewing comet-shaped amulets, or abandoning fields where the comet's light had touched. Kings, meanwhile, spun grand narratives. The same comet that made a milkmaid hide her children might inspire a monarch to commission a tapestry depicting himself as Jupiter, hurling lightning at his enemies. Perhaps no sighting exposed this divide more starkly than the comet of 1456. As it lit up the sky for weeks, German peasants saw Judas Iscariot's vengeful spirit, while Pope Calixtus Roman III declared it a call to crusade against the Ottomans, issuing prayers to ward off the comet's Turks. Neither group knew they were witnessing the tale of what we now call Halley's Comet, nor that its appearance coincided with a dust veil from a massive volcanic eruption that would trigger years of famine. The real omen wasn't in the sky, but in the earth. Yet for medieval minds, the cosmos remained the ultimate mirror, reflecting back whatever fears or ambitions they carried beneath it. History remembers the names of kings, astrologers, and monk scholars, But what of the women who mapped the stars from castle towers and cottage doorsteps? Take Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess who mixed theology with celestial observation. While male scholars debated Aristotle, her handwritten manuscripts described the moon's pull-on, the humors of the earth and womb, linking lunar cycles to medicine centuries before modern science confirmed tidal effects on biology. Her visions of the cosmos as a cosmic egg with nested spheres weren't just mystical, they challenged the male-dominated view of a rigid, mechanical universe. In peasant communities, women's astronomy thrived in moonlight rituals and oral traditions. Midwives timed deliveries by the moon's phase, noting that more babies came during the waxing moon, an observation modern studies suggest might correlate with gravitational effects on amniotic fluid. Herbalists harvested plants when specific constellations rose, believing correctly that medicinal potency varied by season. A Welsh rhyme still recited today, when Cassiopeia leans, gather valerian keen, encoded generations of observational wisdom about optimal harvest times. These women couldn't attend universities, but their almanacs were written in the language of roots, stars, and birthing chambers. The tools of female astronomers often doubled as household objects. A distaff for spinning wool became a measuring stick for the North Star's height. The rim of a baking sieve transformed into a star chart when held up to the sky. In Scandinavia, women used the night spindle, a notched stick that, when aligned with Polaris, could predict the return of sunlight during winter's darkness. Their greatest instrument was memory. Before bedtime, mothers taught children star rhymes like this German one. When the lady's chair Ursa Minor tips, the frost will nip. What scholars dismissed as folk rhymes were actually precision calendars, preserving data across generations, yet their contributions faced brutal suppression. When Trotula of Salerno, an 11th century healer, published texts linking menstrual cycles to lunar phases, male physicians redacted her work, attributing it to imaginary male authors. In 1431, a French midwife named Perrette was burned as a witch for using a star chart to predict plague outbreaks, a crime today we'd call epidemiology. Even noblewomen faced limits. When Elena of Provence gifted King Henry Roman III an astrolabe in 1252, court chroniclers credited its design to her male astrologer rather than her own years of study. The most poignant resistance might be in what survived. In a Bohemian convent's ledger from 1388, Sister Agnes scribbled planetary observations between laundry lists, proof that even cloistered women stole moments to track Jupiter's moons. Basque shepherdesses carved constellation maps into their crooks, while Italian lacemakers encoded star patterns into their designs. These weren't just pretty symbols, they were covert celestial libraries, preserving knowledge when books were forbidden. What's heartbreaking is how much we've lost. The names of most peasant stargazers are forgotten, their wisdom surviving only in folk sayings or the stubborn habits of grandmothers who still plant beans when the Pleiades rise. Yet their legacy lingers in unexpected places. The six-pointed star quilts of medieval women doubled as winter solstice markers, their seams aligning with sunrise on the year's shortest day. In the end, these women didn't just read the stars, they wove them into the fabric of daily life, turning oppression into ingenuity, one constellation at a time. When the Black Death swept through Europe in 1347, leaving villages silent and streets piled with corpses, even the stars seemed to tremble. Peasants whispered that a sinister conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the house of Aquarius had poisoned the air, a belief so widespread that doctors wore beaked masks stuffed with herbs, convinced the alignment had turned the very atmosphere toxic. Meanwhile, King Philip VI of France paid his court astrologers triple their usual fee to scour the heavens for an answer, only to receive a chilling verdict. The plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins, written in the language of planets. In a world where medicine offered no cure, the cosmos became the only script anyone could read. What's haunting is how differently that script was interpreted. For a shepherd watching his flock die, the Milky Way's pale band transformed into the path of souls, guiding the dead to judgment. His wife might not read thread into her children's clothes during a waning moon, believing its fading light could unweave the plague's grip. Yet in Avignon, Pope Clement VI's astronomers charted the same sky and declared the disaster foretold by a solar eclipse years earlier, one they dismissed until bodies began piling up. The stars didn't change, desperation did. Astrologers became the medieval equivalent of pandemic experts, their credibility soaring even as their predictions grew wilder. Some claim the plague moved at the speed of Mercury's retrograde, sparing towns where the planet appeared stationary. Others insisted victims born under Leo's sign survived more often, a grim early stab at epidemiology through star signs. The most manipulative saw opportunity. In Siena, a charlatan sold anti-pestilence amulets engraved with zodiac symbols, swearing they'd deflect Saturn's malice. When buyers died anyway, he blamed their insufficient faith in the stars. Yet amid the hysteria, glimmers of real science emerged. Muslim physicians in Andalusia noticed plague peaks correlated with lunar cycles, leading them to quarantine patients during full moons when cases spiked, a practice Christian Europe dismissed as Saracen superstition until it worked. In Vienna, a nun's diary recorded how she'd observed serious brightening before each outbreak wave, a pattern modern astronomers confirm was caused by atmospheric dust from burning plague corpses. Even peasant precautions held hidden logic. Hanging juniper boughs during Mars-ruled hours inadvertently sanitized homes as the smoke killed fleas carrying the disease. The Church's response exposed its celestial double standard. While bishops condemned stargazers for usurping God's will, they quietly allowed processions during auspicious planetary hours, timing prayers to Venus when her influence was thought to soften divine wrath. In Florence, a priest was defrocked for casting horoscopes to predict who'd survive, only for his methods to be adopted by the very cardinals who'd tried him, their names scrubbed from the records. By the plague's end, the stars had become a mirror for medieval society's fractures. Wealthy merchants paid to have their birth charts rectified to show they'd always been destined to survive, while paupers blamed their misfortune on being moon-crossed at birth. Kings commissioned tapestries of zodiacs protecting their lineages, as if the cosmos itself endorsed their rule over the dead. Yet perhaps the most revealing artifact is a child's doll found in a London mass grave, its chest painted with Orion's belt, a parent's last attempt to arm their little one with stars against the darkness. In the end, the heavens offered no answers, only a canvas for the living to project their terror and hope onto the infinite. Consider the star chart scratched into the wax lining of a shepherd's wooden bowl, a crude circle with dots for the North Star and Orion, its lines worn smooth from generations of thumbs tracing winter's longest nights. Beside it, picture a Burgundian duke's manuscript, its vellum pages alive with gold leaf constellations, each star a pinprick of crushed sapphire. Both were maps of the same sky, yet they spoke in different tongues. One whispered in the shorthand of survival, the other shouted in the dialect of power. Medieval star maps were never just navigational tools, they were cultural fingerprints. Peasant astronomers relied on what we'd now call folk cartography, carving constellations into fence posts or stitching them into the borders of wool blankets. These weren't drawn to scale but to memory, prioritizing the handful of stars that mattered most. The Big Dipper might stretch across half the sky in a farmer's sketch because its position marked when to shear sheep, not because the artist didn't know better. Accuracy took a backseat to utility, turning star maps into mnemonic devices as practical as a knotted string around the wrist. Meanwhile, monastic scribes and royal artisans approached the heavens with a different kind of hunger. Their celestial atlases, like the dazzling Aratia manuscripts, copied ancient Greek star lore onto pages where Virgo wore embroidered gowns and Draco the dragon coiled in real gold leaf. Here, artistry wasn't decoration, it was theology. The brighter a star was gilded, the more it reinforced the medieval belief that heaven's hierarchy mirrored Earth's, saints and angels glowing brightest, just like kings and bishops. Yet for all their beauty, these lavish maps often contain glaring errors, constellations flipped backward or planets placed incorrectly. Why? Because the artists were illustrators, not astronomers, and their patrons cared more about the splendor of the cosmos than its mechanics. The tension between beauty and precision played out in unexpected ways. Some of the most accurate medieval star charts survived not in books, but in the margins of agricultural almanacs. A 15th century German farmer's almanac, now in Vienna's library, shows painstakingly measured star positions alongside planting dates, proof that when survival was at stake, artistry bowed to function. Conversely, a famous Catalan atlas from 1375 places Jerusalem at the world's center while depicting the Indian Ocean as a river of silver, its stars arranged more for symbolic harmony than navigation. What united these disparate maps was their shared struggle to tame the infinite. Whether drawn in charcoal or lapis lazuli, every chart wrestled with the same paradox: how to flatten the dome of night onto a surface. Peasants solved it by focusing only on what their eyes could see from one valley, monks by imagining the sky as a jeweled curtain separating earth from God's throne. Both approaches, in their way, were right, and both were hopelessly incomplete. Perhaps the most telling detail lies in the wear patterns. The Duke's gilded manuscript sits pristine in a climate-controlled museum today, but the shepherd's bowl is worn thin where his fingers rubbed Polaris night after night. One was made to be admired, the other to be used, and in that difference we see the medieval cosmos whole, a place where stars were both divine mystery and daily bread, depending on whose hands held the map. To the medieval mind, the idea that astronomy and astrology were separate pursuits would have seemed absurd, like dividing medicine into real and imaginary aches. A monk calculating Easter's date by the moon's phases saw no contradiction in also using those same calculations to predict which noble families would face misfortune that year. The sky was a single text, its pages filled with both mathematical precision and divine intention. Consider the curious case of the Alphonsine tables, commissioned by King Alfonso X of Castile in the 13th century. These painstakingly accurate planetary position charts were used equally to navigate ships and to determine the most auspicious hour for royal bloodletting. The same scribe who noted Jupiter's retrograde might annotate its meaning for the king's digestion in the margins. This fusion of observation and interpretation played out dramatically in agricultural cycles. A peasant woman planting beans during the waxing moon wasn't just following tradition. She was applying generations of recorded data showing how lunar gravity affected soil moisture, while also whispering prayers to the Moon Maiden for fertility. Her almanac might feature precise diagrams of the Pleiades rising next to charms against star-induced blight. What we'd call superstition and science were threads in the same tapestry, woven together by necessity. Even the most educated scholars of the age, like the Venerable Bede, saw celestial events as both measurable phenomena and divine messages. When he documented an eclipse in 734, His notes included its exact duration alongside speculation about which biblical prophecy it might fulfill. The tools themselves embodied this duality. Take the volvella, a rotating paper disc found in medieval manuscripts that could calculate moon phases with remarkable accuracy. Turn it one way and it predicted tides for fishermen, spin it another, and it revealed which zodiac sign governed a patient's illness. Universities taught planetary motion not as abstract physics, but as the literal movement of angelic intelligences through crystalline spheres. This wasn't ignorance, it was a different framework for understanding causality, where natural laws and spiritual forces operated in concert. Nowhere was this blend more explosive than in medicine. A doctor trained at Salerno might prescribe bleeding only when the moon was in Aries, not because he disbelieved in anatomy, but because he saw the body as a microcosm of the celestial macrocosm. Manuscripts show surgeons timing operations based on Mars' position, convinced the planet's association with iron-influenced surgical tools, an eerie precursor to modern studies on how planetary gravity affects fluid dynamics in the human body. When the Black Death struck, physicians wore bejeweled talismans engraved with star positions alongside their plague masks, hedging their bets between contagion theory and celestial wrath. The real division wasn't between science and magic, but between who got to interpret the sky's messages. A village wise woman reading weather patterns in cloud formations risked accusations of witchcraft, while a university-trained astrologer making far wilder claims about planetary influences on personality was handsomely paid. Power dictated which celestial readings were deemed legitimate, not any inherent difference in method. The same constellation that guided a midwife's herbal harvest might, in a bishop's hands, become proof of God's displeasure with heretics. What's fascinating is how this fluid thinking advanced real discovery. The quest to perfect horoscopes drove improvements in telescope design. Astrological medicine's focus on planetary timing led to more precise lunar calendars. Even Newton, often hailed as the father of pure science, spent more time on alchemy than physics. The medieval sky was a mirror that reflected back whatever the gazer sought, whether that was the angle of a plow or the fate of empires, and its greatest legacy might be reminding us that all science begins with looking up and daring to ask why. Hidden between the saints' feast days and phases of the moon in a peasant's almanac lay something revolutionary, a rebellion of practicality against the gatekeepers of knowledge. These handwritten booklets, often no larger than a man's palm, were medieval Wikipedia meets farmer's almanac, where the Virgin Mary's holy days coexisted with advice to plant turnips when the moon hung low. Unlike the lavishly illustrated astrological codices of nobles, these were working documents, their margins stained with candle wax and dirt, their wisdom honed by generations of trial and error under the open sky. Take the Calendarium Hortense from 14th century England, a crumpled parchment passed down through 5 generations of a single family. Its opening pages listed church holidays in red ink, but flip further, and you'd find a star chart scratched in charcoal showing when to prune apple trees based on Orion's position. Beneath that, a rhyme warning. If the moon's horns tilt up when the cuckoo first calls, store double the hay. Modern meteorology confirms this was spot on, that lunar alignment often presaged a wet summer. This wasn't magic, it was data science disguised as folklore, where every couplet packed centuries of observation. The real genius of these almanacs was their hybrid nature. A single page might note that St. Swithin's Day, July 15th, predicted 40 days of rain if it drizzled, a belief still whispered today, while also tracking the dog days from July 3rd to August 11th, when Sirius rose with the sun. Peasants knew this period brought heat waves that could spoil milk, so they fermented cheese earlier. even the saints weren't just spiritual markers. Their feast days aligned with solstices long before Christianity co-opted them. St. Lucy's Day on December 13th, that was the old winter solstice under the Julian calendar, still guiding when to slaughter livestock before deep frost. Production was a grassroots effort. Village priests often compiled almanacs as part of their duties, blending church doctrine with local wisdom. In one Breton example, the Annunciation of Mary, March 25th, is followed by a table showing how many finger widths the sun should clear the horizon at planting time, measured using nothing but a raised hand. Other almanacs were collaborative projects, with midwives adding moon phases for childbirth, fishermen noting tide patterns, and blacksmiths recording which constellations yielded the hardest iron when ore was smelted under them. Surviving examples reveal ingenious adaptations. A German almanac from 1400 uses different colored inks for celestial events, red for eclipses, bad omens, blue for planetary conjunctions, good for marriages. Another from Italy has tiny holes punched next to certain stars. Held up to sunlight, they projected onto a farmer's tunic, showing where to look for Venus that evening. Some even included primitive apps, rotatable parchment discs called volvels that calculated movable feast days or predicted lunar phases with surprising accuracy. The Church's relationship with these almanacs was tense but pragmatic. While bishops condemned superstitious weather predictions, they turned a blind eye because peasant tithes depended on harvests timed by those very stars. In a delicious irony, some monastic almanacs quietly incorporated pagan star lore, rebranding the Pleiades as the Seven Sisters of Mercy, while keeping their agricultural advice intact. What's astonishing is how these ragged booklets outsmarted elite science. When the Black Death hit, university-trained doctors blamed planetary alignments, while peasant almanacs simply noted, "Avoid marshes when the evening star flickers green," likely recognizing that miasma, bad air, gathered in wetlands at dusk. Their authors couldn't read Latin, but they decoded something far more vital: the rhythm of the earth itself, written in the language of stars, seasons, and survival. Long before the printing press made knowledge a commodity, these smudged pages were the original open-source software passed hand to hand, refined with each generation, proving that sometimes the deepest wisdom fits in the pocket of a threadbare coat. Alfonso X of Castile, known as El Sabio or the Wise, didn't just dabble in astronomy, he turned it into a royal obsession. In 1351, he gathered Jewish, Muslim, and Christian scholars in Toledo, funding a translation project that would preserve ancient star knowledge while pushing it forward. His famous Alphonsine tables, meticulously charting planetary movements, became the medieval equivalent of a bestseller, used from Paris to Cairo for centuries. But Alfonso's passion had a darker edge. Legend claims he once muttered that if God had consulted him during creation, the universe would have been more orderly, a blasphemous joke that haunted his reputation. His story captures the double-edged sword of royal astronomy, patronage that advanced science, but also the hubris of kings who thought the stars owed them answers. Then there's Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, whose fascination with the heavens bordered on mania. He kept Arab astrologers at his Sicilian court like prized pets, demanding they predict everything from battle outcomes to the sex of his unborn children. When they warned him against attacking Milan in 1237, he ignored them and lost spectacularly. His response: he threw the astrologers in prison, then commissioned even more elaborate star charts, as if the problem wasn't the predictions, but the predictors. Frederick's reign shows how monarchs weaponized celestial knowledge, treating it less as truth and more as a tool to justify their whims. Contrast this with Charlemagne's pragmatic approach. He didn't just hire stargazers, he made astronomy part of statecraft. His Admonitio Generales decree in 789 required monasteries to teach computational astronomy, ensuring priests could calculate Easter correctly. For Charlemagne, the stars weren't about personal glory, but unifying his empire under a shared calendar. Yet even he couldn't resist celestial propaganda. His biographer Einhard claims the emperor timed his coronation to coincide with a propitious alignment, proving God smiled on his rule. Perhaps no ruler embodied astronomy's dangers more than Charles VI of France. Plagued by madness, he became obsessed with his court astrologer's prediction that he'd die by iron and water. The king banned all blades from his presence and avoided rivers, only to collapse from terror during a masquerade when torchlight reflected off a dancer's costume, making it appear drenched in bloody water. His paranoia shows how easily celestial insights could warp into self-fulfilling prophecies when wielded by unstable minds. These monarchs left contradictory legacies. Alfonso's tables advanced navigation, yet his arrogance alienated the church. Frederick's imprisonments chilled scientific inquiry, but his translations preserved Arab astronomy for the Renaissance. Even Charlemagne's educational reforms came with a price, tying celestial study tightly to religious orthodoxy. Their stories remind us that in the Middle Ages, astronomy was never neutral. Every star chart bore the fingerprints of power, every observatory a monument to royal ambition. The sky might belong to everyone, but kings would always insist on holding the telescope. Walk into Chartres Cathedral, and your gaze might lift to the soaring Gothic arches, but look down. Beneath the feet of centuries of worshippers, a sprawling zodiac wheel is embedded in the nave floor, its 12 signs circling like a celestial clock. This wasn't some heretical graffiti, it was sanctioned by the church itself. From France to England, medieval stonemasons chiseled secret star lore into the very bones of sacred spaces, hiding astrology in plain sight between saints and scripture. A farmer kneeling to pray might rest his hands on the carved ram of Aries, while above him, stained glass transformed sunlight into Virgo's sapphire glow. The heavens weren't just painted on church ceilings, they were woven into the stones where peasants and kings alike came to kneel. These zodiac carvings served a sly double purpose. To the clergy, they symbolized divine order. The 12 apostles echoing the 12 signs, Christ the Son of Righteousness, ruling over all. But to the illiterate majority, that same Taurus bull near the baptismal font was a familiar friend, marking the season to plant beans when the constellation rose at dusk. In the Cluny Abbey's capitals, Pisces swim alongside St. Peter, their stone scales whispering of Lenten fasting and spring fishing seasons. Even the church's calendar played along, feast days often aligned with zodiac transitions, masking pagan solar markers beneath holy names. St. John the Baptist's June birthday, that was the old summer solstice, now baptized much like the peasant standing in the nave, whose grandfather had once lit bonfires to honor the sun god on that very night. The real rebellion lay in who got to interpret these carvings. A bishop might preach that the zodiac represented the harmony of creation, but the baker's wife tracing Libra's scales in the cloister saw her own balancing act harvest loaves measured against winter's hunger. In Exeter Cathedral, a mischievous mason hid a nude Sagittarius drawing his bow toward a prudish saint's backside, a silent joke for fellow craftsmen. These weren't just decorations, they were a celestial dialect shared across class lines, where the stars spoke in a language both holy and human. What's most revealing is how these symbols endured purges. When later reformers smashed idolatrous statues, the zodiacs often survived too useful to destroy. Farmers needed to know when Virgo's appearance meant harvest time, even if priests called it the Virgin's Month. The stars, it seemed, were the one scripture neither church nor king could fully censor. High above the altar or underfoot in worn stone, they kept their ancient promise that heaven belonged to everyone who dared to look up or down. When the moon's shadow swallowed the sun whole, even kings trembled. Medieval chronicles describe the solar eclipse of 1233 as a moment when day became night at noon, and all men, high and low, fell to their knees. For those few eerie minutes, the cosmic spectacle erased the rigid lines between peasant and prince, both equally powerless beneath the sky's sudden darkening. In villages, mothers clutched their children, fearing dragons or demons had devoured the sun, while court astrologers scrambled to interpret the event as either divine favor or warning for their royal patrons. The same celestial phenomenon that sent farmers rushing to light bonfires to rekindle the sun had monarchs poring over ancient manuscripts, desperate to spin the darkness to their advantage. Eclipses became the ultimate test of medieval power structures. When totality darkened Paris in 1239, King Louis IX famously ordered his entire court into penitent prayer, draping himself in sackcloth as if the eclipse were a personal rebuke from God. Meanwhile, his subjects whispered that the event foretold his impending crusade's failure, a prophecy that proved grimly accurate when he was captured in Egypt. The church wielded eclipses as spiritual cattle prods, with priests declaring them reminders of judgment days approaching darkness unless congregations repented. Yet some peasants saw opportunity in the chaos. Records from Kent describe how a cunning miller used the 1285 eclipse to fake a miracle, claiming the Virgin Mary's veil had dimmed the sun to bless his stolen grain stores. The folklore surrounding these events reveals a fascinating blend of terror and ingenuity. Icelandic sagas tell of villagers banging pots to scare away the sky wolf during eclipses, while German farmers buried axes blade up to split the darkness. These weren't mere superstitions, they were survival tactics for a world where the sun's disappearance threatened crops and livestock. In one Yorkshire village, elders taught children to mimic roosters during eclipses, their crowing believed to trick the sun into rising again. The same eclipse might inspire a Welsh bard to compose apocalyptic verse and a Bolognese medical student to sketch the corona's structure, proving that wonder and scientific curiosity could coexist even in the Middle Ages. Royal courts turned eclipses into propaganda spectacles. Before the 1257 eclipse visible across Byzantium, Emperor Theodore II Lascaris had his astrologers predict the exact minute it would begin, then staged a miracle by commanding his soldiers to raise torches precisely as darkness fell, creating the illusion he controlled the heavens. More pragmatically, Venetian merchants used eclipse predictions to manipulate markets, buying up wheat futures when peasants panicked about failed harvests. The stars might not play favorites, but medieval society certainly did, interpreting the same celestial event through lenses of fear, profit, or divine right depending on who held the pen. What's most striking is how these moments of cosmic unity inevitably fractured back into hierarchy once daylight returned. The eclipse of 1339 was recorded in both a French peasant's diary, God hid his face to shame our sins, and King Edward III's court chronicle, a sign the Almighty favors our claim to France. Two interpretations, one sky, yet the king's version would be immortalized in tapestries, while the peasant's words survived only as charcoal scratches on a crumbling scrap of parchment. Eclipses may have temporarily leveled humanity beneath the shadow, but when the sun reappeared, so too did the medieval world's unyielding order, kings with their astrologers, peasants with their folk rhymes, and the vast, untouchable heavens continuing their indifferent dance above them all. Gerbert of Aurillac began life as a peasant's son in 10th century France. herding sheep under the same stars his father had watched for generations. By the time he became Pope Sylvester II, he was designing silver globes to map the heavens and introducing Europe to the astrolabe, a journey so improbable it sparked rumors he'd sold his soul to the devil for celestial knowledge. His story wasn't just extraordinary, it was a crack in the medieval world's rigid social order, proving that mastery of the stars could, on vanishingly rare occasions, become a ladder out of the mud. What set Gerbert apart wasn't just genius but timing. Taken as a youth to a Catalan monastery near the Moorish border, he encountered Arab astronomers who saw his hunger for learning. While most Christian scholars still debated whether the earth was flat, Gerbert absorbed advanced mathematics and astronomy from Islamic texts, later smuggling this knowledge into Christendom like celestial contraband. His breakthrough came when he combined peasant practicality with elite scholarship, crafting a sighting tube to observe stars more clearly, then using those observations to correct errors in the church's calendar. Suddenly, the boy who'd counted sheep under the Pleiades was advising emperors on eclipse predictions and designing clockwork orreries that left bishops gasping. Yet Gerbert's rise exposed the limits of social mobility. For every peasant astronomer who escaped the fields, thousands saw their knowledge appropriated without credit. Take Heloise of Brittany, a midwife whose star-based fertility charts were copied by a monkish scholar and rebranded as his own discovery. Or the unnamed Slavonian stargazer whose precise comet observations in 1184 were recorded in imperial annals not under his name, but as a certain rustic's amusing notions. Even Gerbert faced whispers that his instruments were demonic, his innovations too radical for a man of low birth. The unspoken rule was clear: celestial knowledge could elevate you, but never quite erase where you came from. The Church's role in these exceptions was deeply contradictory. Monasteries occasionally plucked bright peasant boys like Gerbert for education, yet barred them from rising beyond certain ranks. When the shepherd-turned-astronomer Hermann of Reichenau composed sacred music based on planetary harmonies in the 11th century, his hymns were sung in cathedrals, while he himself, crippled and of humble origin, remained confined to his abbey cell. The same institution that preserved star lore also policed who got to interpret it, ensuring most peasant astronomers remained anonymous contributors to illuminated manuscripts or builders of cathedral zodiacs, their hands shaping the cosmos while their names vanished into the parchment. What's haunting is how these rare successes altered history. Gerbert's papal reign saw the first major reforms of the Christian calendar, laying groundwork for the Gregorian system we use today. The astronomical clocks designed by lower-class craftsmen in 14th century Prague and Strasbourg became marvels of medieval engineering, their gears turning to the rhythm of peasant observations centuries old. Even the humble astrolabe, once a nobleman's toy, was democratized by traveling artisans who adapted its designs for farmers and sailors. The social ladder might have been steep, but the stars themselves remained gloriously indifferent to bloodlines whispering the same secrets to plowmen and popes alike, if only they dared to listen. The same constellations that guided a medieval plowman's planting now glow as pixels on a farmer's weather app, their ancient names unchanged: Pleiades, Orion, the Bear, but their power distilled into algorithms. That wooden quadrant once whittled by candlelight, its descendant sits in your smartphone, using GPS and gyroscopes to map the night sky with tap and swipe precision. Yet for all our technological leaps, the human urge to find meaning in the stars remains stubbornly medieval. Modern horoscopes may hide behind sleek interfaces, but their roots tangle deep in the same soil as those royal astrologers who whispered predictions to kings. Take the farmer's almanac, still printing planting dates tied to moon phases. its pages a direct descendant of those wax-stained peasant booklets. The science has advanced, but the instinct hasn't. Both eras share the belief that celestial rhythms pulse through the dirt and seeds. Even NASA moon-planting experiments nod to this legacy, proving what medieval women knew when they sowed herbs under a waxing moon, that gravity's tug affects more than tides. Astrology apps now serve the same role as court stargazers once did, offering cosmic validation for life's chaos. A duke consulting his horoscope before battle isn't so different from a teenager checking her daily zodiac forecast before a first date, both seeking certainty in the stars' cold fire. The tools have glamorized, but the hunger remains. Consider how eclipses still command headlines, their awe undimmed by modern astronomy. When totality darkened North America in 2017, millions gazed upward with the same mix of terror and wonder as those medieval farmers lighting bonfires to rekindle the sun. Yet some divides have truly narrowed. The gilded astrolabe that once cost a village yearly harvest now exists as free planetarium software, its knowledge democratized. What was locked behind monastery walls or royal decrees now streams to anyone with a library card or internet connection. The night sky, once sliced into parcels by class and creed, has become, at least digitally, a commons again. Perhaps the most poignant echo lies in our lingering myths. SpaceX engineers may calculate rocket trajectories with quantum precision, but they still name their spacecraft after mythological star voyagers Dragon, Orion, Starliner. Like the medieval mason who carved zodiacs into cathedral stones, we can't quite let go of the stories. Even the Mars rovers carry names chosen by schoolchildren, continuing that ancient tradition of tethering the cosmos to human narrative. The constellations haven't changed, but our place among them has no longer just observers, but explorers. Yet when we point our telescopes at Jupiter's moons or photograph distant nebulae, we're still answering the same call that made a shepherd pause mid-field to squint at the Big Dipper, his breath fogging the cold air as he wondered, what else is up there? The instruments have grown sophisticated, but the question remains deliciously, eternally medieval. When the rebel priest John Ball stood atop a hill in 1381, pointing to the constellation Libra balanced above the Kentish fields, he wasn't just reading the stars, he was rewriting their meaning. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, he thundered to the gathered peasants, twisting the nobility's own astrological language into a weapon. To the ruling class, Libra symbolized divine order and harmony. To Ball's followers, it became a celestial scales demanding justice. This was astronomy as insurrection, where the same night sky that justified kingship could be turned against the crown with a single, fiery sermon. The English peasants' revolt didn't ignite by accident. Its leaders deliberately timed their march on London to coincide with the June full moon, not just for light, but because they knew royal astrologers had declared the period under Mars' influence, a time when the common folk grow restless. By co-opting this prophecy, the rebels weaponized the elite's superstitions. Wat Tyler's army even carried banners stitched with the Pleiades, a constellation traditionally associated with sowing, but now repurposed as a symbol of seeds of rebellion taking root. The nobles' own star charts, which claimed planetary alignments dictated their right to rule, became their undoing when peasants shouted back that the heavens demanded tax relief and fair wages instead. Across Europe, celestial symbolism fueled resistance. In 1450, Hungarian serfs staged their uprising during a rare alignment of Jupiter and Saturn, an event royal astrologers had pompously declared would strengthen the nobility's divine mandate. The rebels spun it differently, spreading pamphlets claiming the conjunction marked the death hour of oppression. Their timing was brutally strategic. When the king's mercenaries hesitated, fearing celestial wrath, the peasants seized 3 castles before the lords could muster defenses. Even the tools of stargazing became instruments of revolt. In Brittany, farmers repurposed wooden quadrants meant for measuring harvest moons to calculate the optimal nights for tearing down enclosure fences under cover of darkness. The church fought back with celestial propaganda of its own. When the Ciompi wool workers revolted in Florence in 1378, priests declared a sudden comet was God's displeasure at their audacity. But the workers had their own star readers, women who'd learned astronomy from grandmother's tales, who countered that the comet's tail pointed not toward hell, but toward the corrupt guild halls. For illiterate rebels, the sky became a shared text they could all read. A single meteor streaking over a rebel camp carried more persuasive power than 100 royal decrees. What made these celestial rebellions so potent was their inversion of power. Kings claimed the stars spoke only to them through court astrologers, but peasants proved the heavens were polyglot. The same Venus that guided a noblewoman's marriage horoscope also told vineyard workers when to strike for higher wages, her evening appearance signaling the start of the fragile grape harvest, when lords couldn't afford labor disruptions. By 1400, the fear of astrological unrest ran so deep that the Duke of Burgundy banned peasant almanacs mentioning planetary movements, fearing they'd become manuals for sedition. Yet the stars' greatest gift to rebels wasn't symbolism, it was coordination. Under a moonless sky in 1396, Frisian freedom fighters used the pre-dawn position of Orion's belt to synchronize attacks on 3 tax offices simultaneously. Welsh bards smuggled rebellion plans inside innocent-sounding star rhymes, knowing English soldiers wouldn't grasp their double meanings. And when the German Bundscha rebels needed to spread word of their 1524 uprising, they didn't risk letters. They instructed village astronomers to watch for Mars dipping below a certain church spire, the signal to march. The ultimate irony, many rebel leaders had learned their stargazing from the very institutions meant to suppress them. Jack Cade, leader of the 1450 Kent Rebellion, was a former monastery scribe who'd copied zodiac manuscripts for wealthy patrons before turning that knowledge against them. His demands included not just land reform, but public access to the learning of the spheres, a radical notion that the sky's wisdom belonged to all. Though his head later adorned a London spike, his celestial rhetoric lived on in tavern songs comparing corrupt lords to eclipsed moons hiding their theft of heaven's light. By the time Copernicus rearranged the cosmos centuries later, the real revolution had already happened, not in the halls of science, but in the fields where generations of peasants had looked up and realized the stars didn't care about crowns. The night sky, once a mirror for royal vanity, had become a shared compass for the dispossessed, its constellations mapping not destiny but defiance. Buried beneath the more famous Astrolabes and armillary spheres lie the Torquetum and Nocturnal, 2 medieval marvels that showcase how stargazers bridged the gap between backyard ingenuity and celestial precision. Picture the Torquetum first, a towering wooden contraption resembling a cross between a sundial and a modern telescope mount. Its stacked discs could pivot to account for a viewer's latitude, transforming it into a portable mathematical universe. With this device, a scholar in Paris could measure the moon's altitude while compensating for the curvature of the Earth, a feat of engineering that wouldn't look out of place in a Renaissance workshop. Yet many Torquetums were built by anonymous monks or village carpenters, their gears whittled from oak and calibrated using nothing but a knife and a keen eye for the North Star. Then there's the Nocturnal, a deceptively simple tool that turned timekeeping into poetry. Crafted from brass or even bone, its rotating discs aligned with Polaris and the Big Dipper to tell the hour long after sunset. Shepherds used pocket-sized versions to guard flocks through the night, while sailors relied on larger models to navigate the Mediterranean's inky waters. The genius of the nocturnal wasn't just in its function, it was in its democratization of the night. Unlike the gilded astrolabes locked in noble coffers, these could be replicated by any artisan with a compass and a steady hand. Some of the most fascinating devices blurred the line between tool and talisman. Take the Navigational divinities, a boat-shaped sundial favored by Italian merchants. Its carved hull held secret compartments for storing medicinal herbs believed to absorb harmful planetary rays during travel. Other instruments, like the Quadrans Vetus, embedded lunar phase calculators into walking sticks, allowing farmers to track both time and tides as they moved between fields. Even children's toys doubled as educational tools. Spinning zodiac tops taught constellation patterns while subtly reinforcing the church's calendar of feast days. What's startling is how many of these technologies were lost to history, not because they failed, but because they worked too well. The Torquetum's versatility made it a victim of its own success, replaced by specialized instruments during the scientific revolution. Its all-in-one design dismissed as crude by later scholars who prized precision over adaptability. Meanwhile, the nocturnal faded into obscurity once mechanical clocks proliferated, though modern pilots still use its core principle for celestial navigation when electronics fail. The real tragedy lies in the stories these objects might have told. A Torquetum's worn notches could reveal which monasteries prioritized lunar observations for calculating Easter, while a peasant's sundial, scratched with constellations unrecognizable to modern eyes, might encode forgotten folk astronomy. These weren't just tools, they were diaries of the night sky, written in wood and metal by hands that understood the heavens as both clock and compass. Today, as digital apps render even telescopes obsolete, there's something humbling about a world where knowledge wasn't at your fingertips, but in your willingness to stand outside, tilt your head back, and let the stars guide your hands as much as your mind. When Geoffrey Chaucer's pilgrims set off toward Canterbury in the Canterbury Tales, their journey mirrored the celestial rhythms governing medieval life. The wife of Bath boasts of reading horoscopes to time her marriages, while the miller's crude tale hinges on a misaligned Astrolabe, a nod to both peasant superstition and noble gadgetry. Chaucer, himself a courtier and customs official, wielded astronomy like a double-edged quill. His verses celebrated the stars as both scientific marvels and metaphors for human folly. In The Franklin's Tale, a scholar's promise to remove rocks via tidal magic leveraging moon phases becomes a cautionary fable about blurring the lines between celestial mechanics and hubris. The same sky that guided plowmen's almanacs here frames a poetic warning. Knowledge, like the tides, has limits even kings can't override. Dante's Divine Comedy took this celestial metaphor to cosmic heights. His pilgrim doesn't just traverse hell and purgatory, he ascends through Ptolemy's crystalline spheres, each heaven governed by a planet's influence. Mars emboldens warriors, Jupiter blesses just rulers, and Saturn humbles monks. But Dante's genius lay in democratizing this cosmic hierarchy. When he finally reaches the Empyrean, beyond all stars, he finds not just saints and kings but a humble baker named Folco, a sly reminder that divine light shines equally on those who need bread and those who wear crowns. The comedy became a celestial bridge. Peasants heard echoes of their folk astronomy in Dante's spheres, while nobles marveled at his alignment of cosmology with church doctrine. Even obscure texts wove stars into their fabric. The Pearl poet Sir Gawain and the Green Knight times its hero's quest by the winter solstice, his journey punctuated by references to Orion and the Pleiades constellations farmers used to predict snow. The poem's pentangle shield, adorned with celestial symbols, mirrors the peasant practice of carving star charts into tools for protection. Meanwhile, Marie de France's lies spun lovers' fates as tangled as ecliptic paths. Her werewolf knight's transformations sync to lunar cycles familiar to any midwife or shepherd. Literature's true alchemy was turning astronomical fact into shared myth. When Chaucer described April rains stirring pilgrims' wanderlust, he echoed peasant lore linking spring downpours to Pisces' dominance. Dante's vision of Satan frozen at Earth's core inverted peasant fears of star-cold winters that could kill crops and kings alike. These writers didn't just borrow from the stars, they gave them back to readers as mirrors, where a milkmaid might glimpse her own resilience in Ursa Major's steadfast arc, and a duke could see his ambitions reflected in Jupiter's gilded glow. The page, like the night sky, became a place where all ranks could meet not as serfs or sovereigns, but as fellow travelers beneath the same wheeling constellations. On a bustling street in 12th century Toledo, a Jewish scribe hurriedly copied an Arabic star chart while a Christian monk peered over his shoulder, struggling to pronounce the unfamiliar names of constellations. Meanwhile, in a Syrian observatory, an astronomer adjusted his brass astrolabe using calculations from a Sanskrit text before his work would eventually find its way into the notebooks of a French peasant midwife. This was the Silk Road of stars, where Islamic astronomy didn't just influence it transformed how both kings and commoners understood the night sky. The real game-changer arrived in the form of the Zij al-Sindhind, an 8th century Arabic work blending Indian, Persian, and Greek astronomy. When this text reached Al-Andalus Islamic Spain, it sparked a knowledge revolution. Muslim scholars like al-Zarqali refined Ptolemy's star tables while inventing the universal astrolabe, a device adaptable to any latitude. But here's what's fascinating. These innovations didn't stay locked in ivory towers. By the 1100s, Latin translations of Zarqali's work were circulating in European monasteries, where scribes, often unaware of their Arabic origins, copied them into agricultural almanacs. Suddenly, a German farmer planting by the moon found himself relying on calculations made centuries earlier in Baghdad. Peasant astronomy absorbed Islamic knowledge through quiet, practical channels. The Arabic star names we still use today, Altair, Aldebaran, Vega, trickled into rural dialects via traveling merchants. A Provençal vineyard keeper might not know Al-Nasser al-Tair meant the flying eagle, but when he heard Spanish traders call it Altair, he adopted it into his planting rhymes. Even the humble wooden quadrant used by shepherds evolved, its degree markings now more precise thanks to Arabic trigonometry, though its users likely never knew the mathematics behind it. Royal courts, meanwhile, flaunted their Islamic-inspired tools as status symbols. When Frederick Roman II of Sicily wanted to impress visiting diplomats, he'd display his Arabic-style celestial globe, its surface etched with constellations labeled in Latin, Arabic, and Hebrew. This wasn't just multicultural window dressing, it was a power move. By mastering the heavens through Islamic lenses, Christian rulers implied they'd usurped not just land but knowledge itself. Yet the irony was thick. Many of these prized Saracen instruments were already outdated in the Islamic world, where scholars had moved on to more advanced theories. The Church's relationship with Arabic astronomy was complicated. While clerics condemned Muslim stargazers as infidels, they eagerly adopted their eclipse predictions to set Easter dates. The Tolden Tables, compiled by Arab and Jewish astronomers in 11th century Spain, became the Vatican's secret weapon for calendar reform, even as priests preached against the heresy of celestial determinism. In monasteries across Europe, monks painstakingly erased Arabic names from star charts, only to accidentally preserve them in margin notes where they scribbled, "Hoc est Arabicum," this is Arabic. What's often overlooked is how Islamic astronomy democratized stargazing. Persian polymath al-Biruni's method for calculating the Earth's circumference using mountain shadows was simplified into peasant proverbs about long noon shadows meaning far to Mecca. The Arabic lunar calendar, more accurate than Rome's, secretly guided farmers resisting the church's mismatched solar feast days. And when a midwife in Normandy timed deliveries using a phase of moon chart, she probably didn't realize it derived from the canon of Ibn Sina, a medical text that linked lunar cycles to bodily humors. The exchange wasn't one way. European observations trickled back east too. A 14th century Syrian astrolabe now in Damascus bears faint Norse runes near its latitude markings, likely added by a Scandinavian trader who learned to use it during Baltic voyages. And the famed Muwakit timekeeper of Cairo's Al-Azhar Mosque incorporated Frankish sundial designs into his prayer time calculations. The stars, it seemed, refused to respect borders or creeds. This cross-pollination peaked with Alfonso X's Libros del Saber de Astronomia, a 13th century Spanish compilation where Jewish translators rendered Arabic texts into Castilian, which monks then translated into Latin. Within its pages, an Egyptian star map sat beside a Frankish zodiac, and a peasant's moon phase rhyme borrowed from a Berber shepherd's song. The cosmos had become a bazaar with ideas exchanged as freely as spices or silk. Yet for all this blending, tensions simmered beneath. When King Pedro of Aragon commissioned an astrolabe in 1384, he demanded it bear no infidel script, Unno, where its very design came from Muslim Granada. And in a sad twist, the same Arabic star catalogues that enabled Copernicus' heliocentric theory were later cited as proof of Islamic intellectual decline by European scholars. The stars themselves witnessed how knowledge could bridge worlds and how politics could redraw those bridges into battlements. What endures are the quiet traces, the Andalusian olive growers who still say, Aldebaran brings the rain, unaware they're invoking an Arabic star name centuries old. The Sicilian fishermen whose moon-tide chants contain fragments of Ibn Majid's navigation poems, and in the vaulted ceiling of the Capella Palatina in Palermo, where Christian saints share space with gold-leaf Arabic constellations, a silent testament to that brief, brilliant moment when the Mediterranean skies belonged to everyone who dared to look up. As we return from this journey through medieval skies, one truth shines clear. The stars were humanity's first shared language, yet their meanings were as divided as the earth below. Whether peasant or king, the hunger to understand the cosmos bound them together even as their worlds kept them apart. Let these stories remind us that the night sky is both a mirror and a bridge, reflecting our differences while offering endless wonder. If these tales of stargazers past have ignited your curiosity, share your thoughts below, and may your own gaze upward be as bold as theirs. Think of the last time you looked up at a truly dark sky far from city lights. Those same stars that guided a medieval plowman still pulse overhead, unchanged by centuries of human drama. The Big Dipper that told farmers when to sow now gleams above suburban rooftops, its shape identical to what kings once embroidered onto their banners. Time has rewritten so much borders, languages, technologies, yet the constellations remain faithful to their ancient patterns, indifferent to who observes them or why. What's haunting is how these celestial constants reveal both the fragility and resilience of human understanding. The peasant who feared comets as divine wrath and the astrologer who spun them into royal propaganda were equally wrong about their nature, yet their shared awe wasn't misguided. Modern science may have stripped the stars of their omens and deities, but not their power to humble us. When astronauts on the International Space Station glimpse Orion through a window, they're completing a chain of wonder that stretches back to the first storyteller who ever pointed at those three bright stars and saw a hunter's belt. The medieval sky also teaches us about the danger of gatekeeping knowledge. For all the Church's attempts to control celestial interpretation and kings' efforts to monopolize astrological tools, the stars refused to be owned. A monarch's gilded telescope couldn't make the moon wax faster. No papal decree could halt a comet's path. In an age when land, titles, and even scripture were doled out by privilege, the night sky remained refreshingly anarchic, a realm where a shepherd with a notched stick could predict an eclipse more accurately than a court scholar with an astrolabe. Perhaps that's why these stories resonate today in our era of algorithms and space telescopes. We may have mapped the cosmic microwave background and landed probes on Mars, but we still crave the intimacy our ancestors found in the stars. Apps can identify constellations in seconds, yet people still gather at planetariums to hear the old myths how Perseus rescued Andromeda, or how the Scorpion chases Orion across the heavens. The science enlightens us, but the stories connect us. So the next time you step outside on a clear night, try this. First, let your modern mind admire the astrophysics, the nuclear furnaces of distant suns, the light traveling millennia to reach your eyes. Then slip into medieval shoes. Imagine those pinpricks of light as a farmer's calendar, a king's destiny, a midwife's guide. That duality, the stars as both quantifiable phenomena and human companions, is their eternal magic. They invite us to be both rational and reverent, to measure their distances while still making wishes on their fleeting trails. In the end, the medieval stargazers' greatest legacy wasn't their instruments or charts, but their insistence that the cosmos mattered to everyday life. They may have gotten the mechanisms wrong, but they were right about one profound thing. The sky isn't just overhead. It's woven into our bones, our stories, our hunger to find meaning in the dark. Whether you're checking a weather app or sketching Jupiter's moons through a telescope, you're part of that unbroken lineage. The methods have changed, but the longing remains to look up, to wonder, and to feel, just for a moment, both insignificantly small and profoundly connected. Now it's your turn. Step outside tonight, find one bright star, and let it anchor you across time. That light may have left its source when Chaucer penned his tales, or when Wat Tyler's rebels marched under its glow. You're seeing exactly what they saw, a reminder that under the vast, shared sky, every generation gets to write its own stories in the stars. The question is, what will yours